thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who are joining a First Principles session for the first time, I'll just give a quick intro about what it is. So, First Principles is a product webinar series hosted by Gojek to host people like Dexter today to talk all things product and growth. It's a platform for product enthusiasts to share ideas, learnings, and mistakes. I'll share the link of the meetup group which we have in the chat. You can join that and stay up to date with what we are up to. We are very excited to host Dexter today, who has a lot of stories and lessons to share with us. Thank you so much for taking out the time and joining us, Dexter. I'll
Thank you, Ayush.
I'll just give a quick intro about you and hand it over to you. So Dexter is currently a product manager at Zendit, where the company which is building payment solutions for businesses across Southeast Asia. Before Zendit, Dexter was a growth PM at Dropbox, where he had a roller coaster journey during the company's rapid scaling towards an eventual IPO. During this time, he helped scale a growth team and built the consumer SaaS business. Outside of his product work, he's also a tech career coach, and I recommend you go check out his website for a lot of good read. So, thank you, Dexter. Over to you. Please fill in wherever you think I've missed out on things.
Sure thing. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ayush, and to your team for inviting me onto this webinar. It's very exciting to be with y'all today. And thank you, everyone who's just joining this webinar right now. So as you can see from this slide, my presentation is going to be focused on lessons learned from building and growing Dropbox. And my experiences there. And I'm hoping over the course of the next 45 minutes to cover a broad swath of different lessons learned. But if you have any questions that I don't answer, but you'd like to get answers on, then feel free to enter them into the question prompt, and then we can take some questions for the last 15 minutes of the session. So as Ayush mentioned, I was a growth PM at Dropbox. I worked on mobile and consumer product growth there from 2015 to 2018. Worked in Silicon Valley for 6.5 years during that time across various high growth startups. And after that, I took some time off to do some traveling across Europe, South America, and Asia. During that time, I was starting a tech career coaching business, and today I'm leading growth and applications at Zendit, which, as you just mentioned, is a payment gateway and payments-oriented startup across Southeast Asia. So before Dropbox, I worked at a couple of online education startups as well, called Creative Live and Udemy. And then before that was a college student in the frigid northeast of America at Dartmouth, and decided to never experience snow ever again, which is why I'm now in Singapore. So for today's agenda, what I really like to do is first just kick things off with a little bit of an introduction of how I got to Dropbox and what that start of the journey kind of looked like for me. And then I'll get into some of the bigger lessons learned, as well as examples of those lessons. So I have 4 that I want to share with y'all today. The first lesson is around how retention is the best indicator for a healthy product. The second lesson is around how you want to nudge user behavior thoughtfully towards getting more product value. The third lesson is around adopting an experimentation mindset. The fourth lesson is focused on building the machine that builds the machine. And then we can wrap it all up and end with a summary and conclusion. So as you can see, a lot of these lessons are targeted towards the process of building products and growing products when you're working in a high growth startup. I think this can be pretty applicable across high growth startups around the world, even in the Southeast Asia region. And we can get deeper into why that is and how those applications might look like throughout the presentation and in your questions. So just to kick things off, Dropbox IPO'd in March 2018, 10 years after much anticipation from the public and definitely from its investors. They had waited quite a long time for their returns to pay off. And you can see from this photo, we all look pretty happy on IPO day. We're on the rooftop of Dropbox's office in San Francisco, celebrating the big day in our hard work leading up to that big day. On the right-hand side, you'll see a news article that talks about where we ended up in terms of our first day on the market. We were valued at a $9.2 billion valuation, which was not too far off from the $10 billion valuation that investors had put it at in the last funding round a few years before that. That was really exciting because we had proved that we could match up to investor expectations, which not a lot of startups get to say they do. So just to talk a little bit more about the start of the journey, rewinding backwards to 2015. During 2015, we started seeing a whole lot more unicorns coming onto the scene of tech startups. So I joined Dropbox's growth team in the summer of 2015, which, as you can see from this slide, there was just over 100 unicorns by that point of time. And many of these startups gained high-flying valuations rather quickly over the course of a couple of years. So there was a lot of excitement during that time. And you could see that with a lot of press coming out expressing excitement about starting a unicorn business or investing in one, joining one. And these unicorns kind of became a point of obsession for tech journalists at the time. Everyone was talking about them. So like I mentioned, a lot of the unicorn kind of press coverage was positive because it was kind of a hot thing at the time to talk about. Well, that said, Dropbox actually as a unicorn had quite a bit of negative coverage because it had already been a unicorn for several years since 2011. And people were starting to question, when is Dropbox going to IPO? When is Dropbox going to prove that it's worth the valuation that it was given? When is Dropbox actually going to start making money? So while the company was viewed as one of the flag bearers of the SaaS movement, in 2015, it was actually a little bit controversial in the press. The press was asking, is there a bubble? Has Dropbox lost its way? Has business growth slowed down? Competitors like Box and Google Cloud were coming up at the time. So the press was wondering if they were going to squeeze Dropbox out of the market. So when I joined and then looked inside the company, I was a little bit concerned. What I was going to find, was I going to find some skeletons in the closet? But fortunately, the inside wasn't what the press was cutting the company out to be. When I joined the team and walked through the office, I could definitely feel a buzz in the air and growing sense of momentum. And also my colleagues definitely seemed focused on getting the business on the right track. There were some decisions made earlier to focus on the consumer business. They built a mobile consumer app called Carousel, which they unfortunately had to fold. So that was kind of where some of this press coverage was coming from. But everyone was starting to shift gears towards, okay, maybe it's time for us to start focus on growing the business in a different way. And this taught me an early side learning, which is that things aren't always what they appear, especially since the media's incentive is to stir up controversy. And their articles may not reflect reality. The other side lesson here was learn to stay focused and not get distracted. So I talked a little bit about me and the start of my journey. to Dropbox now. I'll share some of the lessons I learned over the course of the next 3.5 years and how they might be applicable to product and growth people working in Southeast Asia. So lesson number one is that retention is the best indicator of a healthy product. I know this sounds really simple, but I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who work in startups who just focus on growth and care about grow, but they don't talk to me as much as about retention. And I think that's a missed conversation. So first I'll just clear things up with a definition of retention that I use, which is retention is the number of users still active within a certain time period that you define. So how you define that period is kind of up to you based on your product. For example, a tax software product, let's say one called TurboTax in America, that's more of an annual use type product. So your retention might be more measured on like an annual basis because you only file taxes once a year. While a TikTok, that's a consumer mobile app where you're probably more hooked to use it on a daily basis or multiple times per day. So your retention, it looks more like a daily use kind of pattern. In Dropbox's case, we were more of a workday usage kind of product. So we cared more about looking at our users' usage on the daily or weekly kind of usage level. And strong retention normally reflects that there's strong product market fit. There's no kind of point in pouring the fuel on the fire of a product's growth if there's poor retention, because no matter how you run the numbers in a growth model, you'll just end up getting churned users. So it's very important to have that retention first before you really pour the fuel on the fire. Lastly, on this point, Dropbox's secret sauce as a business was its freemium model. So it did a really good job at building a sign up that was frictionless, having a sticky kind of engagement model that kept people coming back, and then enabling people to upgrade via in-product upsells that were tailored. So now I'll just get into another kind of simple way to think about retention. There's many ways to measure retention, but what I prefer to talk in terms of is a retention curve because it's simple, but still actionable. So as you can see here, there's 3 different types of retention curves on this chart. One is the declining retention curve. Most products, I would say, actually fall into this category, unfortunately. And if you're here, you can see like eventually you're just going to churn all your users. If you're here, really try to flatten the curve so you go from this gray line to the orange line, so then you can at least get a sustainable kind of retention and business going. The second type of curve is this flattened retention curve. If you're already here, then that's great. You're in a place where your business is a lot more viable. Then your next step is to try and raise this retention curve to a higher point, maybe to the green line here. And then the third type of retention curve is this smiling retention curve. And the reason why it's called a smiling retention curve is because the retention curve first goes down, but then over time, as the users get more and more engaged, the retention rate actually picks back up. And some of the best-in-class software products have this kind of user behavior. Evernote is an example of this, that they've shared their public data of their smile retention curve. Uber has also been talked about as an example of a smiling retention curve. So Dropbox definitely cared a lot about retention and building a good product first that had that retention, and that enabled it to do a bunch of things. So one of the things that enabled it to do was to accelerate its acquisition loops. And what I mean by acquisition loops is the ability to bring on new users and customers to your product. In Dropbox's case, it's a freemium model, so we're bringing on free users. And the referral program was one of the big ways that it drove that growth in its early days. When I got to Dropbox, I noticed that we talked about creating flywheels or growth loops a lot internally. I liked that because I liked that already Dropbox was kind of thinking about how do we create something out of what we already have as an asset. And that's because growth loops are closed systems where the inputs through some process generate more of an output than can be reinvested in the input. That's a quote from Casey Winters here, who's a chief product officer at Eventbrite. And some of you may have heard of this referral program already from Dropbox. It's because it was one of these programs that people like to talk about as an example of a growth hack. It's a good example, I think, of a growth loop that's enabled by user retention because the users ended up staying long enough to refer multiple people within their community. And that ended up helping drive that early growth. So how that loop kind of looked was in the first step, the user signs up for Dropbox. Second step, they get value from their Dropbox because they start storing stuff and they start collaborating with other people. Third step, they like it and they want to get more space, so then they invite their friends or colleagues to join. And then in the fourth step, those friends and colleagues, they click the link, they decide, okay, I'm going to join, and then they complete this whole loop. And so the more that Dropbox is sticky, where people are getting the value, the more that they actually stick around long enough so that they will invite their friend or colleagues to join for a free space. Same thing with monetization. We need people to stick around on a product long enough so that they will end up upgrading for a subscription or being upsold, or however you end up converting them to customers. So what I have shown here on this slide is the monthly subscription cohorts from the Dropbox public filing document that it needs to file with the SEC before it goes public. It's called an S1 document. I like this chart because it demonstrates the beauty of the freemium model and subscription unit economics. And what this chart says is that we would sign up free users, which would be represented in the start of this cohort. And over time, the amount of revenue that would be generated would increase from that same number of users. And the reason why is because they would start off as free users, and then over time, we would be offering them more value, and then they would upgrade to an individual paid plan and use that to get more space. And then they would find applications to use it in their business or at work. So then eventually they would upgrade to business paid plans. So these free trials grease their path to become a subscriber. And as a result, each of these cohorts and new users typically generated higher subscription revenues over time. And without strong retention and tailored upgrade pathways, the chart wouldn't have looked like this. It may have looked like going downward over time. So, an example of what one of those upgrade paths look like that accelerated monetization is when users ran out of space. So the first team that actually helped build Dropbox was managing the cross-platform experience for users when they do run out of space. We called people in this particular user state an overquota user. So running out of space is a critical kind of upsell trigger. While a significant chunk of our overquota users subscribed, within, let's say, a week of running out of space, there was this huge long tail of users that didn't monetize for several years, actually. So healthy kind of long-term user retention was really key to getting those people who would stick around for several years before they start upgrading to then start monetizing with Dropbox. And I think this holds true for a lot of products with smiling retention curve. For example, Uber users didn't always spend a lot at the beginning. And maybe same thing for Gojek users, I don't know. But over time, as the product gets stickier and stickier in their daily life, then they start spending more on other stuff, and that increases their value. So last example I want to give is an example of what happens when you don't have retention. So Dropbox Professional was a new plan that we launched in 2017, and it came with a bunch of new features. One of those features was called Dropbox Showcase at the time. And this was a feature that enabled mostly independent professionals, freelancers, to share their work with their clients, easily track the progress, and keep tab on who has seen their work on one place. And this feature launched with a big kind of splash. It was around the same time we did a big redesign of the whole brand. However, there was only one problem. Early tests showed that Dropbox Showcase didn't have the retention that we were really looking for to really kind of pour fuel on the fire. So users who use Showcase were no more likely to retain with Dropbox at that time than users who didn't. And as a result, one of the decisions that we made as a growth team was not to invest very deeply in growing Showcase usage. It would have just been too much pain without as much reward if we had gone down that path. So those were a few examples. And just to summarize the lessons here, there's a few takeaways. One is diagnose your retention rates. Make sure that you actually do a measurement of it. The second takeaway is if you have a good retention curve that looks like a flat or smiling one, then double down on growth. Third takeaway, if you have a poor retention curve, like it's declining, then fix the retention first before pouring more fuel on the fire. And then lastly, design these tailored pathways for users to upgrade so that they can get more value over time from your product. All right, so that was lesson 1. And in lesson 2, I want to talk about, okay, now you kind of got retention for your product all figured out. Now, how do you incrementally drive growth from your product? So the lesson number 2 is focused on that, which is nudge user behavior thoughtfully towards getting more product value. I have on this slide one of my favorite ways of describing growth. It boils it down really simply. I don't remember who told me this, but it stuck with me to this day. So what growth boils down to me is this equation: growth equals product value minus friction. And what this means is that growth is when you have enough users getting product value from your product, and there's nothing getting in their way of actually getting that product value from your product. You would be surprised to see how much friction there is in most of the products we're using nowadays. One side note on this equation is people always ask me, what's the difference between a core product manager and a growth product manager? So the difference in my mind is that a core product manager would be responsible for unlocking these new product values or product capabilities that users didn't previously have, while a growth product manager will be responsible for accelerating that rate at which users adopt and engage these capabilities, which usually means removing the friction. So just to emphasize one more time, just because features exist within your product does not mean users will actually use them. Growth is what identifies and pulls these key levers to better connect your users with your product's actual value. And this is one of my favorite quotes around nudging, which is, I think, what most of the big tech companies in Silicon Valley are doing now in order to drive user behavior. So a nudge is any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives, said Richard Thaler, who is a behavioral economist and Nobel Prize winner. And I want to emphasize that a nudge is a choice architecture, that you give people a choice that impacts their incentives. So you're not blocking them from doing the thing that they actually want to do in your product. You're not creating a downgrade flow that's 20 steps and then they have to call, someone to actually cancel their subscription. You're giving them a choice. So here are some of the nudges that actually worked for us at Dropbox. And I think this slide might be maybe one of the more applicable ones for people who are actually working in startups today in a product growth or even marketing capacity. All of these small nudges can make a really big impact on the business, and I'll explain why. So there's a bunch of nudges here. I'll just go through them one by one. So the first is launching free trials. We saw at Dropbox that whenever we launch free trials on both the business side and on the consumer side, that reduced a lot of the barrier to entry for people to experience the value of the product, which is just really critical to actually getting them to retain with the product. A lot of times people don't try something out unless if they can experience it for free. At least that is the case in the American market. It may be the case in your market as well. Second nudge here is that contextual in-product upsells are the most effective upsells that I've seen. So for example, going back to the over quota upsells I was talking about earlier, those were the most effective upsells for the consumer business for Dropbox because they are the ones that are most deeply embedded in the people's product usage. So test out the different product actions to see which ones actually matter the most and are the most correlated with your product's core value. The third nudge here is making notifications more visible. I have an example of this later. This is especially the case if users don't see your notification, which actually happens all the time. Fourth nudge is improving information hierarchy. I have an example of this as well. This is something that's important, especially for a product that's starting to mature, maybe going from the startup to the mature stage of their existence, because there tends to be a lot of clutter in the product. Next one is around visual changes that demonstrating urgency are powerful. And the last one is pricing messaging. So now I'll go into a few examples of these nudges. So this example is around the iOS new user experience. In our onboarding flow for iOS at Dropbox, we had a few different steps. People would sign up. They would then be prompted to upload their camera photos. And then they would be prompted to link their desktop app. And then they would be prompted to do a couple of other things. But what this flow, what this kind of shows in these screenshots is two different sets of experiences. So the one on the left is showing the experience that's shown to Dropbox Basic users who are free users. So they only have access to a manual camera upload feature because that's a free feature. And then the right-hand side shows users who are already on a free trial because we actually prompt users if they want to try out a free trial before they get to this step. And if they're on a free trial, they actually get access to a paid feature called automatic camera uploads. And we surface that instead. So what we noticed as a problem was that people didn't know people didn't know that automatic camera uploads were a paid feature. It was not known to users. And we also noticed that adding photos to Dropbox during onboarding required a lot of cognitive load for those users. So the majority of people skipped this step. They just didn't even bother. However, when we introduced automatic camera uploads for these paid users or free trial users, then we saw that this tailored kind of segmented experience led to a significant lift in the automatic camera uploads. And we saw that segmenting the flow actually encouraged them to get more engaged with that feature, and surprisingly even more engaged with the feature in this next onboarding step, which is desktop link usage. So it seemed like they used it more, and then they started to engage with other features across their Dropbox usage, which was really exciting. This is an example of where kind of personalizing the flows can really make make a difference. All right, so this example is focused on our iOS account tab. We redesigned this account tab in 2018 and vastly improved the information hierarchy. I'm actually really proud of this initiative because even though we didn't necessarily launch a new kind of product capability for users, we made a huge difference for their experience. So our problem was that account tab was getting cluttered. The legacy experience hadn't been updated since the account tab launched, I think, which created a lot of friction. And actually, if you clicked into this little blue gear at the top left, you'll go into submenus, and all of them were a mess too. So we hypothesized that if we could improve this visual clarity and the information hierarchy, so people would actually be able to view their account information, view all their menu options, and also upgrade, change, and cancel their plans more easily, then we could increase their usability and their ability to pick pay plans too. So that's what we saw in the result. We saw that improving this information hierarchy from the left-hand side to the right-hand side actually resulted in more people discovering the upgrade CTA, choosing a different plan, and they were able to navigate the contents of the account tab much more easily. So this visual clarity, made things just a lot simpler and more seamless for our mobile app users here. The learning was plan information as well as key to nudging users. So prior to this, we tested adding these big upgrade banners to the top of the account tab. Those actually failed. So it wasn't just the upgrade CTA that was an improvement. It was actually telling users that they were on the Dropbox basic plan here, which we do, but it's much further down in the legacy experience. So bring that information up next to their name, I think really helped improve the information hierarchy. And this initiative showed that even small UX improvements can make a pretty big business impact. So this one felt really good because we did it right by the users, retired some technical debt, legacy UX, and also made some money. And it was kind of a nice bonus that the VP of product at the time congratulated us on delivering a delightful customer experience. Cool. Next one is a more simple, straightforward one around pricing messaging. So this goes back to 2015, right around the time that I joined Dropbox. This is one of the first experiments that I ran at the time. The problem statement then was that Dropbox is an intangible kind of piece of software. Consumers who, especially were not tech savvy, could not relate to how much value was in an intangible piece of software. So it felt very expensive to our consumer users. So we thought, hey, why not contextualize the price in terms of their everyday purchases so that they would understand the value of Dropbox relative to what they're already buying in their daily life. And that might improve their likelihood of purchasing. And that's what we saw happen, actually, adding that contextual pricing here, which is this message that says Dropbox Pro is as affordable as 3 cups of coffee per month, actually resulted in a pretty significant size lift in subscription rate. And just to mention, each time these lifts result in a few percentage points increases. That actually is millions in terms of Dropbox annual recurring revenue because of the scale and the size of the consumer user base. So the learning here was that contextualizing the pricing makes it more amenable to customers, and interestingly enough, internationalizing the messaging was really important. So we did research on coffee pricing and found it to be different everywhere. Like in Brazil, it's actually twice the price of a lot of other places. All right. Another example is around overquoted desktop notifications. And what we noticed was that we had a lot of desktop notifications that were being triggered at the time. However, when we surveyed our users, especially people who ran out of space, they didn't recall the desktop notifications, and they said they didn't see them. So we discovered that maybe they just aren't aware that they get these notifications. Plus, these users also weren't aware that they ran out of space in general. So this was just a huge source of friction to getting them to realize that their account state was in an out of space state. So we had this hypothesis that making the notification more visible, going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, would mean that they'd want to take action on their account status. And this one led to a 11% lift of the upgrade conversion rate, with only a small number of people shutting off the notifications. This was one of the biggest wins at the time from a monetization perspective. And the learning here is that sometimes all it takes is to remove friction. That's simple to improve, like improving the notification visibility in order to drive greater usage and to drive greater impact. All right, so I talked about some things that worked for us. Here's some things that didn't work for us. Social proofing, that was a complete miss. Sending offers, I probably ran 5 or 6 different initiatives around this. They all failed. Icons and illustrations that kind of signaled the product value, those didn't work. Copy testing, that maybe worked once or twice, and then afterwards we just reached the local maximum and never hit a global maximum. And then lastly is triggering upsells at the wrong times. That just never worked. I highly recommend not doing that because it just also makes customers more frustrated. All right, so here's an example of one of those initiatives that didn't work. Here we have the buy page, which was the page where people could buy a Dropbox Pro subscription at the time. The left-hand side was the old experience, and the right-hand side was the variant experience that we tested. The problem here was that users weren't aware that after they ran out of space, their shared folders actually stopped working, and they could no longer collaborate with other people in their shared folders. So we get a lot of CS tickets about this issue, and we wanted people to become more aware of it. And we thought, hey, why not show users the shared folders that they actually need more space in order to access. So that's why in the variant experience, you have this messaging that says, hey, you have 5 pending invitations to folders from so-and-so, so-and-so. What we discovered is that there was no difference in upgrade rates. It made no difference to people that we were showing the shared folders that they don't get access to because they ran out of space. And later we also discovered that maybe part of the reason was the UX was a little bit janky. Like only 10% of people who were on this list had uploaded their profile pics. So their icons were just these default placeholders of people's initials rather than their actual faces. So it's possible the UX threw people off. But I don't think that social proofing worked for us, because outside of this case, there were also several tests we ran and it wasn't always effective. So it might not work in a SaaS context. Another nudge to avoid in general is sending more emails and notifications. What we discovered at Dropbox is that whenever we sent another upsell email, we could probably get more incremental upgrades from that email. However, that was always a nice kind of short-term result. And there's always the chance that some executive might say, hey, we're getting a little bit shorter on our quarterly numbers. Maybe let's just send that upsell email we have in our back pocket. And I just think that's a trap that you don't want to go down that path, because in long term, these users get frustrated and then they opt out and churn. So fortunately, we made a smart decision and didn't add more emails than were necessary or than we thought were needed to deliver a qualitative, like a high quality experience, unless if we were delivering a qualitatively different UX to users by adding that one email. But I see a lot of products that seem to fall into this trap. And I think the same thing goes for WhatsApp notifications in Southeast Asia. So if you're sending a ton of WhatsApp notifications as well, I think over time users are just going to mute those. So you have to be mindful of that. All right, so the takeaways here are that growth is equal to product value minus friction. Second takeaway is, think like a behavioral economist. The third is, we talked about a bunch of nudges, pick a few that you can put to the test in your product. And the last is don't spam or overly exploit your users. So third lesson now is adopting an experimentation mindset. This is a quote from our VP of product at the time, Todd Jackson. Experimentation is a huge part of our growth infrastructure. In 2012, we were running 2 to 3 experiments per month. These days, we were doing 80 per month. That's in 2017. We're constantly running experiments. This is driving more than $100 million in incremental revenue every year. So this is why I think an experimentation mindset is important for a business, really helps drive growth. And especially to try and be a best-in-class kind of public company in the SaaS category, we had to break through a certain growth rate, a 30% year-on-year growth rate. And I don't think this would have been possible without this experimentation engine. What this quote doesn't mention, though, that this also took a village. So none of this would have been possible without having a large number of people. Out of a company around 3,000 employees, by the time I left in 2018, I think we had around like 150 engineers, product designers, product managers, data scientists, talented people focusing on driving growth. All right, so in this lesson, one of the things I want to mention is think like a scientist. Everything is hypothesis testing and kind of constant iteration. At Dropbox, we called this the test and learn approach. I think it was one of the greatest strengths of our product and business. I want to emphasize that kind of learning and building up institutional knowledge was really big for us in order to take big steps forward as an organization. I see this in companies in Southeast Asia where they'll get to the Series A and Series B stage and then kind of stall. I think in order to get from Series B to a growth stage and then public company, it really takes that institutional knowledge and then thinking about the test and learn mentality in order to drive scale. So big thanks goes to my VP of growth at the time, Giancarlo Leonetti, who formerly drove growth at Atlassian, for teaching us that. One thing I want to mention here is that most efforts to drive business outcomes fail, which is why it's important to have an experimentation mentality. So for example, Microsoft, Netflix, Booking.com, and other companies have data that showed that at best 1 in 3 of their ideas tested creating any measurable positive result. And at Dropbox, our success rate was around 25%. So that kind of confirmed that 1/3 rate. So experimentation mindset is really key to keep pushing forward and staying motivated. And when you're experimenting, you want to create a diversified portfolio of bets. So here you have an example of a prioritization matrix. You've probably seen this before if you're a product person, but it's not a real prioritization matrix, but closely inspired by my days working on mobile growth. Since not every initiative is going to be a winner, you kind of need to take well-placed bets across this matrix, which is why I say under the sample distribution, you might want like a 50% low-hanging fruit, 30% big bets, and 20% optimizations. I also recommend hosting recurring experiment learning meetings. This was, I think, my favorite meeting at Dropbox. This was where product teams had the opportunity to share their learnings, insights, and results with other product teams and learn from each other. So the format would be, it's a 60-minute meeting, and then each presenter would have maybe 10 minutes to present experiment results, learnings, and findings. And there was really good attendance across the organizations, including by executives. So I want to say that by sharing your learnings, you can make your whole team smarter. And if everyone's doing that, then everyone can get smarter. So the takeaways here were, think like a scientist, you're always validating a hypothesis. Make sure you have a realistic kind of sense of what a success rate for your product might look like. If you're running a lot of initiatives, assume somewhere around like a 1/3 rate for getting a win. Third thing is create a diversified portfolio of bets. And then fourth takeaway is create a forum for people to share their learnings. So this is the last lesson, build the machine that builds the machine. These are all lessons about scaling, and I'll cover them really quickly because I know we're short on time. All right, so one quick thing I want to mention here is pay attention to the rule of 3. Phil Lieben, who's the founder of Evernote, said that everything kind of breaks in your company when your company triples in size. And this is the same thing with your organization and teams. So as an example here, when the growth team at Dropbox was 10 people, we worked with designers in kind of an in-house agency type manner. But when we grew to 30 people, this process totally broke down because now the designers didn't have enough context across all the product surface areas we managed. So that's when we started having dedicated design staffing per squad. So this is going to happen over and over across all the functions when you're scaling. Another thing I wanted to just mention is keep building and refining your growth model. You want to keep updating your assumptions regularly. This is an example of one of HubSpot's growth model I found doing online research. So in an early stage startup, you might want to update your assumptions every month. In a Series B and up kind of startup, you probably want to update these assumptions every quarter. Third thing I want to mention is invest in platform tools. So at Dropbox, we had a tool called Prompt, which was an internal growth platform tool that enabled any non-technical staff in the company to create an upsell and a banner, like the ones shown here. You see this big one, Work from Anywhere with Dropbox Business. That was created in a CMS. You see the banners in the menu in the left, created via CMS. The top banner that says out of space, no problem, try Dropbox Business, also created using a CMS. So these enabled the team to save developer time, because otherwise if a marketer wanted to test copy, that would have required a lot of engineering changes. And then lastly is rehearse for the next stage. So to take your business to the next stage requires you to kind of do a rehearsal, much like if you're preparing for a concert or a play. For example, 1 year before Dropbox IPO'd, we actually started rehearsing for it. We built quarterly forecasts, started measuring our numbers more rigorously, and introduced a escalation process around the numbers as well. So those were the takeaways from this lesson of build the machine that builds the machine. Rule 3, everything breaks after a company triples in size. Build and keep refining your growth model. Invest in platform tools and rehearse for the next stage of your business. So to summarize, these were the 4 lessons that we covered. Lesson 1, retention is the best indicator for healthy product. Lesson 2, nudge users towards getting more product value. Lesson 3, adopt an experimentation mindset. And lesson 4, build the machine that builds the machine. All right, thank you guys for your time. Sorry, I'm a little over.
That's okay, Dexter. Thank you so much. That was super insightful. Also with the examples that you shared correlated with Dropbox, that was really, really helpful. So we have a bunch of questions. We'll quickly take those. I know it's pretty late for you, so we'll quickly go through these. Uh,
Sure.
okay, to start with, the first question is, how do I decide marketability of a new product? Any parameters to measure? Anything you suggest? How do you look at the marketability?
Yeah, I really believe in Seth Godin. This marketer says, look for your first 100 fans. And I really buy that mentality as a good way to approach the kind of product market validation stage when you first build a product. You want to find the first 100 fans who are the people who are going to love it so much that they're going to just tell everyone about it. Because then you got people who are willing to buy your product, but also you got distribution because people are willing to tell people about your product. And you solve the two key killers of most early stage products.
Okay, okay. So second question is, how do you run demand generation in Dropbox? How do you think of spending that optimizes for retention and not just for inviting deal hunter users? So
Oh,
anything
can you
very
repeat that?
specific? Yeah. So how do you run demand generation in Dropbox? How is there any way that you optimized for retention and to avoid inviting deal hunter users who usually use leave after the free use?
Yeah, absolutely. I think of lead qualification as super important depending on the nature of your product. At Zendit, we're in the payments business, so we definitely care about qualifying leads as people who are seriously interested in accepting payments for their business. At Dropbox, we cared about if they were intending to actually collaborate with people on their team and not just using it for personal usage. So it's important to have kind of a lead qualification score. Yeah.
Okay, okay. The next question is smiling curve characterized by having terminal value higher than the initial dip? So does it, it's a question on the smiling curve, which you had mentioned. So ultimately, does it end up going higher than the initial starting point?
Oh, which one?
The smiling curve
Oh, the
statement.
Minecraft.
Yeah.
I think that would be really great if it
Yeah.
does, but I think that's a nice to have.
It's
Kind of must.
contextual.
Yeah.
Correct. Okay. Uh, Next question is, do you have any example where initiative to drive retention ends up hurting the product market fit? So in your efforts to drive retention.
Yes. Yes. I see this a lot with churn prevention. So like I mentioned earlier, there's cancellation or downgrade flows that are really long that try and prevent a existing subscriber from leaving the product. And I see this, for example, in American newspaper companies. They always ask me to call their number and make it very difficult for me to call their number because they're never responsive. That's important. That's an example of retention initiative, because if you prevent churn, then you actually retain your customers for longer as a subscriber potentially. One way that you could always measure for if you're doing right by the user is track both your kind of paid retention. So are the people who are actually paying you coming back to your product and paying you again? And also look at your usage retention. So are people who are using your product also coming back? So if you're getting people who are paying you and coming back, but not using you and coming back, then there might be a gap.
Understood. Thanks. Okay, the next question is, in your opinion, is there any distinction between retention and engagement? So the example this person's given is Flappy Bird had a great engagement but low retention over time. So how do you differentiate between the two?
Definitely. Retention to me is, do the customers that you see today come back in X number of days or X number of weeks and months?
Yeah.
Engagement is more, do the customers that use your product or use a certain feature in your product use it very frequently in X period of time. So are they, making 5 payments every week? Are they coming back to your site 10 times a day versus 5 times a day? That's engagement to me.
Got it. Okay. Next question is, with the long term on mind, how do you define or predict the lifetime value for a user? So, did you have such a metric?
Yes, lifetime value was definitely something we looked at Dropbox, and we looked at it more from a perspective of kind of their projected subscription revenues over time,
Okay.
with building in their likelihood for churn. With that said, I want to say that it also, the assumptions behind customer lifetime value change very quickly, and you
Okay.
need to watch out for that, because when you create a customer lifetime value for like a 2-year cohort, your cohorts from 2 years ago might be very different than the ones now. So you might need to build in assumptions for that.
Understood. Okay. Here's an interesting question. It says, how do you convince your CEO who is just after growth and doesn't care for user retention? So,
Oh man, this is a great question. I think it's hard. I think the way to go about it, when I don't know about your situation, but one of the ways that you could go about it, maybe to argue that retention is key to driving that growth, and trying to show him the numbers. Like if you can walk through a model where you show like, here's the difference between if I change the assumption from 0% retention to like 20% retention, and then all of a sudden you get like really big growth curve. I think he might get that more than if you were just to say, yeah, retention is good.
got it. Okay. Here's a question about, I like reading about behavioral economics. You mentioned a quote on Nudge by Thaler. So, are there any book recommendations which you suggest? Any, or if you have it on your website, any recommendation?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Ayush, is there maybe an email that you
Yes.
as a follow-up? Okay, yeah, I can put in some recommendations there.
Perfect. Okay. Next question. How to deliver pricing messaging in a great narrative according to the product, because different products may have different narrative. Do you think pricing messaging is relevant to all products? So
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think pricing messaging is it needs to be targeted to the audience, and different audiences will have different flavors. So what I mentioned as an example works well with consumers because they care about everyday purchases, but businesses will not. And so businesses will need a different type of pricing messaging that's more contextual to what they spend on.
got it. Okay. This question we received during the registrations as well, which talks about how, when you left Dropbox, how did you decide? How do you take that call? And since you have been to Udemy, Dropbox, and now Sendit, what is your way of looking at the companies before you decide to make a move?
Yeah. So when I left Dropbox, I was really looking for a personal break, actually, because it had been a very exhausting kind of period of my life as well. Very fruitful, very rewarding. But I wanted to break to refresh and recharge before stepping back into a startup kind of context. And what I was looking for next was first, a little bit of that time to pursue some of my personal goals, like travel and trying out business ideas like the career coaching. But then after that, then I decided I want to live somewhere different from the US and work in a different tech market. So that's how I ended up in Singapore in Southeast Asia. And Zenit is also a Jakarta-based company, so would be traveling to Jakarta quite a bit if not
That's
for
great.
tourism.
Yeah. Uh, Here, I'd like to mention that if people you'd like to see some beautiful pictures, do go to Dexter's Insta account. I took the liberty to go and check the account, and God, there were some lovely pictures from his travel. Okay.
Thanks, man. Yeah.
Okay, moving on to the next question. When the nudge doesn't work, how do you know the reason or the root cause? Do you conduct a further research or just go ahead with experimenting the nudge until it finally works?
Yeah, so I think there's a little bit of art and science to this. So the science is that you see it in the numbers that this experiment does not work and the nudge fails. The science is also you could reach out to the customer and then actually talk to the customer from that sample that enables you to ask, hey, why didn't this work for you? And then you can get an answer that way. The art is sometimes you need to read in between the lines based on your experiments that you're running. So for example, when we tested the new information hierarchy on the account tab, we already knew that just by making the upgrade CTAs bigger, that wasn't making it more effective. So when we improved the information hierarchy and added, a little bit more bold upgrade CTA, we knew that the reason why there was the change in the numbers was probably more because of the information hierarchy than the upgrade CTA. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Here's a question. How much experimentation is too much? If you keep doing A/B tests over and over again on certain screens or features, won't the users get confused by the ever-changing interfaces? And if it depends on how large your user base is, do you have a rough number as a guideline?
Yeah, I think this is gonna depends on how many users you have. I actually don't recommend most products to have growth teams until they can get a certain number of users where they can run experiments in a reasonable amount of time to get statistical significance. If you're trying to actually run experiments, what I've seen as too much is when you start hitting failure like several times over. Like you make really big changes and it still leads to no impact on your key metrics, even though you either made a really big change or have tried, 10 different things, for example. Then maybe you just hit a global maximum. But it is hard because sometimes you're at a local maximum and maybe you just haven't developed the right hypothesis. That's possible too.
Correct. Okay. Again, there's this question which came a lot during the registrations as well for the product management aspirants. So since you come from a non-product management background, is there anything you suggest for people who are planning to venture into product management or how to go about it?
Yeah, I think coming from a non kind of product background and going to product management, I think what helped the most was really getting more in tune with the development side and the design side, and just getting really close to the engineers and designers who working with them very closely. I think that's one of the key skills that someone from a business background transitioning into product management will lack, because the business person will normally bring some analytical kind of aptitude to the table and some intuition around the customer, but probably not as much from the design and technical perspective.
Okay. Here's a question on experimentation again. It says, how long do experiments typically last, and when is it a good time to call it quit? Call it a quit.
Oh, this is a good one too. for experiments, always have a defined time period that you're planning on running the experiment by. And the reason for that is it will introduce bias if you decide to update the date that you call the experiment by. So avoid biasing yourself, and then just say, okay, I'm going to make this experiment last for 4 weeks. And by the end of the 4 weeks, I'm just going to call it like win or loss. I'm just going to call it right there. And that's proven by several research studies that reduces bias a lot better than if you're updating your assumptions on when you end the experiment regularly. Yeah.
Okay. Another good question about experimentation. So while experimenting at scale, can you speak more about on implementing an experimentation mindset across teams? Do you have some frameworks or best practices which you can share to implement that experimentation mindset?
Yeah, I think the best practice there would be implementing a good process for rapid and iterative testing. So going back to that test and learn kind of model, I think making sure that you have short iterative cycles in your product development process, moving in the agile fashion, but then incorporating a learning phase after you actually launch something, and then using those learnings to inform your next set of initiatives. That'll help you then get into that experimental mindset. And having data, you need to have enough data to measure the performance of your initiative so you can learn.
Okay. There's a question that says, when do you know that an experimentation could be used? Is experimentation part of the roadmap? Do you decide it beforehand, or how do you realize that you can experiment with certain things?
I see. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's on when is the right time to add experimentation to the roadmap. And I think this goes back to a couple of key assumptions. One is, do you have a product that has hit a growth stage, so post product market fit kind of phase of its journey? Two is, do you have enough users to run experiments and then get quantitative results from your experiments in a timely fashion? And three is, do you have that kind of infrastructure kind of set up in terms of having an A/B testing kind of system? And four is, do you have people who can actually do it? Because in the beginning, yes, you might be able to have one person who's like a PM or a marketer or even an engineer run these experiments, but that is not sustainable and really requires a team.
Okay. Here's a question that says, what's your opinion on if you've been in a situation where focusing on one metric has ended up hurting the user experience, or if the focus goes too much on one metric, that ends up hurting the other metrics. So it's again a question. I think if I understand this correctly, it's a question about growth versus retention. So how much do you push for growth? Like you mentioned, the emails and the notifications, you should be very mindful of those to not hurt the experience.
Yeah. From my experience, I've seen products with only one key metric end up, getting lopsided because they're only measuring one key metric. When I see products measuring kind of two key metrics, like there's a primary metric and a secondary metric, that's way better because those kind of balance each other out. So for example, a primary metric might be you are measuring conversion rate, so you're improving conversion. Secondary metric though might be retention. Are the people that you're converting actually retaining? So if your primary metric goes up, but then your secondary metric goes down, that's still not good according to those two metrics. So use paired metrics.
Got it. We'll just take one last question, Dexter. I know we are running late. This question says, what data helped you to decide on the reorganization of the information hierarchy in the account tab? It's an interesting question. It says, do you decide based on data how to go about changes, or is the hypothesis driven through intuition? And is it an idea which you had and you try that? So that balance between data and intuition. So
yes, this goes back to the art and science of growth. So part of the science is you have data that can inform your hypothesis. The art is sometimes you need to read in between the lines of the data, and sometimes you also brainstorm with the team and get hypotheses generated from those brainstorms creatively. Sometimes you also hear feedback from users, from customers. I think in the information hierarchy example, the feedback actually came from our design team and our design team critiquing the account tab and really pushing for a change. So that was more of an internal push. Yeah.
okay. There's some questions which we cannot take right now. It's super late for Dexter as well in Singapore. Please feel free to reach on the links he has given on the screen right now on his LinkedIn, through email, or you can check out his Insta account as well.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dexter. Thank you so much for taking out the time. This was super insightful. We will share the recording of this on our YouTube channel, and I am also sharing the link to our meetup group in the chat. You can join that to stay up to date with whatever updates we have. Uh, Here we go. I've just added those. You'll get a small feedback form once at the end of this. Please it will just take you 2 minutes to fill that up. Please take out the time and do that and tell us where we can improve. If you really love this, please, you can give us a holler on our Twitter handle as well. It's given in the chat. Okay. Thanks, Dexter. We'll end this here.
Thank you, Ayush, and thank you everyone for joining our conversation. Please do fill out the feedback. We'd love to hear from you as well. If you have any further questions, comments, feel free to shoot me an email. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Have a great weekend ahead, Dexter.
You as well.